February 1960, NBC Studios, Miami. The cameras are off, but the tension is fully lit. Cigarette smoke hangs low, mixing with the sharp scent of makeup and hot stage lights. This isn't a rehearsal moment meant for history. It's a private room filled with men who've survived the business by knowing when not to speak. Frank Sinatra does speak, not loudly, not angrily. Quietly enough that everyone has to listen. He talks about music losing its discipline, about audiences being trained to accept less, about an industry that no longer waits for craft, only reaction, no jokes, no performance, just a verdict. Around him, no one interrupts. Producers stare at their shoes, musicians shift their weight, old stars choose silence over risk. Then, a voice enters the room that was never invited, not defiant, not raised, calm enough to be dangerous. Elvis Presley interrupts Frank Sinatra. For a few seconds, the room goes unnaturally still, the kind of silence where reputations can crack, and what Elvis says next doesn't start a fight. It does something far worse. It forces everyone in that room to realize the balance of power has already changed. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. February bled slowly into March of 1960, and the country watched Elvis Presley as if he were returning from a long illness rather than military service. Newspapers printed his photograph again and again, the haircut sharper, the posture straighter, the face leaner. Commentators asked the same question in different disguises. Had the army sanded down the dangerous edges, or merely taught him how to stand still while the world projected its hopes and fears onto him? Inside NBC's offices, the question was less poetic and more profitable. Executives spoke in calm voices about symbolism, about healing the supposed rift between generations. What they really wanted was control. Frank Sinatra hosting Elvis Presley was not just television, it was a ceremony. The old king extending a hand to the young one on camera under studio lights, with a Timex logo ticking quietly in the background. Ratings would spike. Advertisers would relax. The industry would breathe again. Sinatra understood this perfectly. Publicly, he smiled and spoke about respect, about welcoming a young man home from service. Privately, irritation settled in his chest like a familiar ache. He had spent years dismissing rock and roll as noise, as something temporary and crude, and Elvis had been its most visible face. Agreeing to this show was not an act of admiration. It was strategy. He negotiated hard, demanded control over the format, the pacing, the tone. If the crown was being shared, it would be done on his terms. Elvis knew more than people gave him credit for. He read the room even when he wasn't in it. The offer came with polite suggestions disguised as professional advice. Darker suits, restrained movement, nothing that might remind audiences of the boy they once warned their daughters about. A calmer Elvis, a safer Elvis. He listened, nodded, and said yes, aware that refusal would be read as immaturity. The army had taught him how quickly doors closed when you pushed too hard. The contract landed like a quiet thunderclap. $125,000. No performer in television history had been paid that much for a single appearance. The number traveled through Sinatra's circle without comment, yet it changed the air. Assistants avoided eye contact. Musicians joked too loudly. It wasn't envy exactly. It was the realization that the balance had already shifted, whether anyone liked it or not. When Elvis arrived for preliminary meetings, the contrast was impossible to miss. His movements were economical now, almost formal. The discipline of the barracks still clinging to him. Sinatra's world, by comparison, was all practiced ease and tailored confidence, a Hollywood elegance built over decades. They shook hands, cameras clicked, words were exchanged that sounded friendly enough. Beneath it all, both men measured distance between eras, between power, between what had been said in the past and what could no longer be taken back. No one in that building feared an argument. What they feared was something quieter, the possibility that, once they stood in the same space, neither man would bend. The rehearsal floor was never meant to host honesty. It was a functional space, marked tape on the ground, cables coiled like sleeping snakes, the faint smell of hot lights warming too early. Voices usually stayed light here, calibrated for crews and clocks. That afternoon, the door to a side room was half closed, enough to signal privacy but not enough to keep sound from escaping. Frank Sinatra stood with a small cluster of producers, jacket off, sleeves rolled in a way that suggested ease rather than effort. He spoke without anger, which made his words heavier. Rock and roll, he said, had taught audiences to accept less, to mistake volume for feeling, repetition for craft. He wasn't ranting, he was diagnosing. A comment followed about crowds wanting things handed to them, simple and loud, so they wouldn't have to listen too closely. A few men nodded, others stared at the floor. No one challenged him. Challenging Sinatra was never good for longevity. Elvis had no reason to be there. He was supposed to be down the hall, working through arrangements, letting the orchestra feel his tempo. Instead, he paused just outside the doorway, drawn not by his name, but by the tone. He didn't step in immediately. He listened long enough to understand that this wasn't about him personally. That made it worse. When he finally entered, the room shifted before anyone spoke. Sinatra noticed first, his sentence thinning into silence. Elvis didn't apologize for interrupting. He didn't defend rock and roll. He didn't list sales numbers or scream about the kids who waited in the rain to see him sing. He spoke slowly, as if choosing not words but weight. He said that people didn't gather around music because it was easy. They gathered because it named something they couldn't, because no one else had bothered to listen before. Nothing followed that statement right away. No rebuttal, no laugh to diffuse it. The air held. One producer glanced toward the door, as if considering escape. Sinatra's face changed, not softening, not hardening, just recalibrating. He had expected fire or submission. He got neither. Elvis didn't wait for permission to continue. He took a step back, physically removing himself from the center of the room, signaling that this was not a challenge. It was a boundary. He added nothing else. He didn't need to. The quiet carried his meaning farther than any argument could. Sinatra nodded once, barely perceptible, and thanked him for stopping by. The conversation did not resume. When Elvis left, the room stayed suspended, as though everyone understood that something essential had been said, and that responding too quickly would only cheapen it. The night of the broadcast arrived with the polished inevitability of a national event. March 26, 1960, unfolded under layers of choreography so precise they almost erased spontaneity. Studio lights burned white and steady, bleaching shadows from the stage. Applause signs flickered to life like silent conductors, instructing thousands of unseen living rooms when to respond. To the audience at home, it would look effortless. To those inside the building, it felt like standing inside a finely tuned machine. Frank Sinatra entered first, owning the space the way he always had, relaxed, assured, perfectly aware of where every camera would find him. When Elvis followed, the reaction in the room shifted, not louder, but sharper, as if attention itself had changed frequency. He wore restraint deliberately. The movements that once sent sensors into panic were replaced by stillness. It wasn't fear. It was choice. They joked easily enough. Lines written by others landed as if improvised. Laughter rose on cue. Then the music began, and with it came the exchange everyone would remember. Sinatra sang a piece long associated with his name, letting the phrasing stretch, luxuriant and controlled. Elvis listened closely, not waiting for his turn, but absorbing the rhythm, the confidence built over decades. When he answered with his own song, he softened it, stripping away excess, holding notes just long enough to suggest feeling rather than insist on it. The reverse followed. Sinatra stepped into Elvis's melody, adjusting his tone, respecting the simplicity instead of mocking it. It was a subtle shift, but musicians felt it immediately. The orchestra leaned in, watching for cues that hadn't been rehearsed. Tempo slowed by a fraction. Pauses appeared where none had been planned. The music breathed. What the cameras captured was harmony. What they missed was negotiation. Elvis resisted the instinct to provoke, to remind anyone why he had once been considered dangerous. Sinatra resisted the impulse to dominate, to frame the moment as benevolent endorsement. Neither announced the decision. It happened in real time, inside glances and held beats. As the final notes faded, the applause came strong and sincere. Viewers would later describe the moment as warm, even historic. Only those standing closest understood why it felt different. Something unspoken had settled between the two men. Not agreement, not friendship, but recognition. They had shared a stage without erasing each other, and in doing so, quietly redrew the limits of the room. When the applause finally drained out of the studio, it left behind a kind of hollow quiet that only live television creates. The audience was guided toward exits, still buzzing, still replaying moments in their heads. Crew members moved with practiced speed, dismantling a world that had existed for less than an hour. Lights dimmed, the stage lost its authority. Backstage, the air felt heavier. Jackets were loosened, ties pulled down, smiles allowed to collapse. People spoke softly now, as if volume itself had been spent. Elvis stood near a folding table cluttered with half-finished coffee cups, his pulse still slightly ahead of the room. He wasn't celebrating. He was decompressing, letting the discipline of performance release him inch by inch. Sinatra lingered longer than expected. He dismissed an assistant with a gesture that left no room for argument, then turned back, finding Elvis without searching for him. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was earned. Sinatra broke it first, his voice lower than it had been all night. He didn't congratulate. He didn't critique. He remarked, almost to himself, that the business moved faster than anyone admitted, that by the time you learned the rules, someone else had already rewritten them. It wasn't confession, it was acknowledgement, angled just enough to preserve pride. Elvis listened, hands folded loosely, posture relaxed but attentive. He didn't answer with philosophy. He talked about the army instead, about nights in barracks where men passed around a radio like contraband, listening for something that reminded them they were still individuals. He said those songs weren't about rebellion, they were about being noticed. Sinatra considered this, eyes narrowing not in disagreement but focus. For the first time that evening, he looked tired rather than composed. He nodded once, slowly, as if filing the thought away for later use. He said nothing that resembled surrender. He didn't need to. They stood there another moment, two figures temporarily freed from expectation. No promises were made, no bridges formally built. When Sinatra finally walked away, it was without ceremony. Elvis watched, him go, aware that whatever had passed between them would never be discussed again, and that its value lay precisely in that restraint. The morning after the broadcast, the story was already being simplified. Headlines praised poise, maturity, balance. Reviewers wrote as if a transformation had occurred overnight, as if one appearance had resolved years of tension. Elvis read some of it in silence, recognizing the pattern. When the press decided who you were, it rarely asked whether you agreed. Phone calls followed. Studio executives spoke warmly about range and reliability. Film producers hinted at roles that required charm without unpredictability. There was a tone of relief in their voices, the sound of risk receding. The word grown appeared often, usually meant as a compliment. To Elvis, it landed like a narrowing hallway. Colonel Parker moved quickly, not out of excitement, but efficiency. He framed the moment as leverage, proof that the industry was ready to invest heavily, provided the investment stayed safe. More films, tighter schedules, fewer live variables. Parker didn't threaten. He never had to. He laid out numbers, calendars, and obligations with the calm certainty of someone who understood systems better than people. Elvis nodded through the conversations, agreeing where resistance would have cost too much energy. Yet something unsettled him. He hadn't regretted the words spoken off camera to Sinatra. Those felt necessary. What troubled him was how easily the world had used his restraint as evidence that he could be managed. Silence, it turned out, was easily repackaged as consent. Letters from fans reflected the split. Some celebrated the dignity of his return. Others asked, gently but persistently, where the edge had gone. He didn't know how to answer them. He wasn't less himself. He was simply choosing carefully. Still, the gap between choice and expectation widened. From a distance, Sinatra observed the shift without comment. He recognized the pattern immediately. He had survived long enough to know what happened to artists who cooperated too well. The system rewarded compliance first, then demanded more of it. Sinatra said nothing publicly, but privately, he understood the cost of that kind of grace. By the end of the year, Elvis found himself busier than ever and strangely absent from his own decisions. The moment that had felt balanced now seemed tilted. He had avoided a battle, believing that dignity would protect him. What he hadn't anticipated was how quickly dignity could be mistaken for availability. By early 1961, the connection between Elvis Presley and Frank Sinatra existed only in schedules that never aligned. Invitations floated through agents' offices and vanished into polite delays. Award dinners were rumored, charity events discussed, television appearances imagined. Each time, logistics intervened. Someone was touring, someone was filming, someone else decided it wasn't the right moment. From the outside, it looked accidental. From the inside, it felt orchestrated by absence. Elvis heard Sinatra's name indirectly, through musicians who had worked with him, through producers who repeated his comments secondhand, softened by diplomacy. Frank, they said, had mentioned him with a new restraint, no jokes, no dismissals, just acknowledgement. It should have felt like progress. Instead, it felt unfinished, like a sentence cut short before the point could land. Sinatra, meanwhile, made a quiet inquiry about a possible collaboration. Nothing formal, no paperwork, just curiosity expressed to the wrong people. The idea passed through layers of management, filtered, rephrased, and ultimately stalled. By the time it reached Elvis's orbit, it was no longer an invitation, just a rumor of one. The window closed without ceremony. When Elvis finally learned of it, the realization arrived without drama. No anger followed, just clarity. He understood then that the most consequential conversations weren't the ones you had, but the ones others decided you didn't need to be part of. He had stepped back once, deliberately, believing that space created respect. What he saw now was how easily space could be filled by other voices. There was no villain in this silence. Managers did what managers did. Schedules obeyed momentum. The industry preferred predictability to nuance. Still, something tightened in Elvis's chest. The risk he had avoided in 1960 hadn't been confrontation. It had been ownership. He had spoken when it mattered, but afterward he had stopped choosing when to speak. Sinatra sensed it too from his side of the divide. He recognized the familiar shape of opportunity dissolving into process. He had navigated that maze long enough to know its cost. Yet, he didn't force the issue. Experience had taught him that timing couldn't be argued into existence. What remained between them was unfinished respect, real but inert. No disagreement, no resolution. Just the quiet understanding that something meaningful had almost happened, and that almosts in their world had a way of echoing longer than failures ever did. The years folded into one another without sharp edges. From 1962 onward, Elvis moved through sets and sound stages with mechanical precision, his days measured in call times and rewritten scripts. The films performed well enough to silence criticism, which was precisely the problem. Nothing failed loudly enough to demand reconsideration. Success arrived predictably, and predictability became its own enclosure. Live audiences became a memory rather than a presence. The roar that once pushed back against his chest was replaced by polite applause recorded after the fact, edited into scenes long after the emotion had passed. He sang because it was required, not because the moment demanded it. The difference lodged somewhere deep, unnamed but persistent. At night, alone, he found himself replaying fragments of the past. Not triumphs, not scandals. He returned again and again to that room in 1960, the brief stillness after he had spoken without checking who approved. It hadn't been defiance. It had been instinct, the last time he had trusted it fully. The realization unsettled him more than regret ever could. Money accumulated, contracts extended, his name remained powerful, but the weight of it felt redistributed, carried increasingly by others. Decisions arrived prepackaged. Choices were presented as conclusions rather than questions. He rarely objected. Objecting required momentum, and momentum had been slowly redirected away from him. Sinatra's path, observed from a distance, curved differently. Frank allowed himself contradictions. He took risks because he could afford to. Age insulated him from consequences that still circled Elvis closely. Watching this, Elvis understood the irony. Restraint had preserved his image but diluted his authority. No crisis marked the shift. No single moment demanded action. Instead, pressure accumulated quietly, like weather changing without warning. Elvis didn't complain. He didn't dramatize his dissatisfaction. He absorbed it, letting it settle into a question he couldn't yet answer. When had his voice stopped altering the room, and why had no one noticed when it happened? By the late 60s, the silence around him had grown dense enough to be felt. The world assumed he was content. Only he knew how much had been deferred, how many moments had passed without his consent. What waited beneath that stillness was not anger, but readiness, patient, unresolved, and increasingly difficult to ignore. By 1968, television no longer felt like homecoming. It felt like a reckoning. Elvis stepped into the NBC studio not as a returning star, but as a man reclaiming a space that had quietly moved on without him. The set was smaller than anything he'd worked on in years. No sweeping backdrops, no illusion of distance, just musicians in close proximity, cables underfoot, faces visible enough to read. The plan handed to him was tidy and seasonal, built around comfort and familiarity. Songs chosen to reassure, a tone meant to soothe. Elvis read it once and set it aside. This time, he didn't argue. He simply redirected. He wanted conversation, not presentation, exchange, not performance. The producers hesitated, then adjusted, not because he insisted, but because he didn't yield. When the cameras rolled, something immediate happened. Elvis spoke to the musicians as if no one else were listening, and that intimacy changed the temperature of the room. His voice carried neither apology nor bravado. It carried certainty. He interrupted expectations the same way he once had interrupted a conversation years earlier, not to dominate, but to realign focus. The leather outfit wasn't provocation, it was clarity. The stripped-down sound wasn't nostalgia, it was refusal. He rejected the scripted holiday ending, choosing instead to stay in the present moment, unfinished and honest. The silence between songs mattered as much as the notes. Each pause felt deliberate, owned. No names were invoked, no histories recited, yet the principle was unmistakable. Speak when silence no longer serves. Say the thing that shifts the room, even if no one asked for it. The musicians responded instinctively. The crew leaned in. The cameras captured something they hadn't planned for. A man speaking from authority rather than approval. Somewhere far from the studio, Sinatra would hear about it. Not the details, just the effect. The sense that Elvis had stopped negotiating his presence, that he had remembered what it meant to change atmosphere with a sentence, a glance, a withheld beat. By the end of the night, Elvis wasn't restored. He was recentered. The difference mattered. He had not returned to an image. He had returned to agency. and for the first time in years, the room had followed his lead without needing to be told why. The months that followed did not announce themselves as an ending. They arrived quietly, without ceremony, as if careful not to interrupt what had already settled into place. Elvis spent evenings watching old footage alone, not studying technique, not judging youth, but observing moments, how rooms reacted before he spoke, how they shifted afterward. He noticed patterns he hadn't seen when he was living inside them. Influence, he realized, was never loud at first. It moved subtly, then all at once. Across the country, Sinatra gave an interview that passed without headlines. He spoke about younger performers with an unfamiliar restraint, choosing his words carefully, avoiding the dismissive tone that once came easily. There was no apology in his voice, no revision of history, just recognition. He didn't mention names. He didn't need to. Those listening closely understood the adjustment. Neither man ever revisited the exchange from 1960. It remained untouched, preserved by silence rather than memory. Yet its effect had traveled forward, altering decisions, tempering judgments, reshaping how authority could be expressed without force. What had seemed small at the time, a calm interruption, a measured sentence, had proven durable. Elvis came to understand that he hadn't defended a style or a generation that day. He had defended the listener. The ones who didn't speak in boardrooms or write columns, the ones who recognized themselves in sound because nothing else had made room for them. That was why the words had mattered, not immediately, eventually. There was no moral to extract, no lesson neatly framed, just the awareness that timing gives meaning to restraint, and that dignity carries weight only when it is chosen, not assigned. Elvis didn't seek credit for that understanding. He lived with it, letting it guide him quietly. History would remember the night as entertainment. Those who felt the shift remembered something else entirely. The moment when silence stopped being passive and became deliberate. When one voice, used sparingly, changed the shape of the room and waited years to be fully heard.